The first thing I felt was pain. Every part of my body ached as I slowly opened my eyes. The ceiling above me was cracked and stained, and a flickering light buzzed overhead. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was. Then fragments of memory came rushing back. Rain. Headlights. A truck swerving into my lane. The sound of metal crushing together. After that, nothing. I tried to sit up, but a sharp pain shot through my ribs. A man wearing worn-out medical scrubs quickly entered the room and told me to stay still. Something about him felt wrong. He didn't look like a doctor, and this place certainly didn't look like a real hospital. When I asked where I was, he only said, "Somewhere safe." That answer bothered me. Later that night, I quietly left my room and explored the building. It was small, outdated, and half empty. Then I overheard two employees talking. "He's lucky he survived. He shouldn't have." My heart skipped a beat. "Whoever brought him here didn't want questions," one of them said. At that moment, I knew I had to leave. The next morning, I slipped out through the back door and started making my way home. Every step hurt, but I didn't care. I needed to see my wife, Sarah. After hours of hitchhiking, I finally reached the city. The first thing I did was borrow a stranger's phone and call her. The call didn't connect. I tried again. Disconnected. Again. Disconnected. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. By the time I reached my neighborhood, the sun had already set. I turned the corner toward my house and stopped. A moving truck was parked in the driveway. Strangers were carrying furniture out of my home. My furniture. My belongings. My life. Sarah's car was sitting there, but she was nowhere to be seen. I stood frozen on the sidewalk, watching complete strangers empty my house. And for the first time since waking up, a terrifying thought entered my mind. What if everyone believed I was dead? What if everyone believed I was dead? That question followed me the entire night. I stayed hidden across the street, watching strangers carry my belongings out of the house I had spent years paying for. Every box they loaded into the moving truck felt like another piece of my life disappearing. I wanted to run to the front door, to call Sarah's name and demand answers, but something deep inside me kept saying the same thing. Don't let anyone know you're alive. Near midnight, I finally left. I needed answers before I could trust anyone. As I walked through a nearby park, I spotted a newspaper sitting on an empty bench. The date immediately caught my attention. My hands started shaking. According to the newspaper, I hadn't been gone for a few days. I had been missing for nearly 3 weeks. For several seconds, I simply stared at the page, trying to understand how that was possible. Then my eyes drifted toward the obituary section. And my world stopped. There was a photograph of me. My photograph. Beneath it was my full name. A short obituary described me as a loving husband who had tragically lost his life in a car accident. It also mentioned that a private funeral service had been held 3 days earlier. I must have read those words 20 times. None of it made sense. I was alive. I was breathing. Yet somehow I had already been buried. At the bottom of the article was the name of the cemetery. Without thinking, I started walking. The cemetery was nearly empty when I arrived. The sun had already disappeared, and a cold wind moved through the rows of gravestones. Eventually, I found the section mentioned in the obituary. Then I saw it. Fresh earth. Fresh flowers. And a polished headstone. I slowly stepped closer. My legs felt weak. Carved into the stone was my name. My birth date. And beneath it were 3 words that sent a chill through my entire body. Beloved husband, beloved friend. I stood there staring at my own grave, unable to move. Because if I was standing here alive, Then who the hell was buried beneath my name? If I was standing here alive, then who was buried beneath my name? I wanted to go straight to the police, but something stopped me. Whoever had managed to convince the entire world that I was dead wasn't an amateur. If I walked into a police station without understanding what was happening, I could easily end up disappearing for good. There was only one person who might have the answers. Sarah. The next morning, I started following the few clues I had left. Our old house was empty now, but after hours of searching online at a public library, I finally found a new address connected to her name. What I found shocked me. Sarah wasn't living in some temporary apartment while grieving. She was living in a luxury high-rise downtown. The kind of building neither of us could have afforded before my accident. I spent most of the afternoon watching from across the street, trying to make sense of it all. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe she had moved in with family. Maybe someone was helping her after losing me. Then I saw her. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. 3 weeks ago, I thought I had lost everything. Seeing her again should have brought relief. Instead, it brought confusion. She looked different. Not heartbroken. Not devastated. Not like a widow. That evening, I watched her walk onto a rooftop terrace filled with people. Music was playing. Waiters carried drinks from table to table. It looked more like a celebration than a mourning period. Then Sarah smiled, and my stomach dropped. I hadn't seen that smile since before my accident. She raised a glass of champagne and laughed with the people around her. Around her neck hung an expensive diamond necklace that I had never seen before. I wanted to believe I was misunderstanding the situation. I wanted to believe there was an explanation. But the more I watched, the harder that became. 3 weeks ago, I was her husband. 3 days ago, she buried me. And tonight, she looked happier than she had in years. As I sat in my car watching the party continue, a terrible thought entered my mind. What if Sarah wasn't a victim of this nightmare? What if she was part of it? I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her laughing on that rooftop while my grave sat under fresh dirt a few miles away. By morning, I realized I needed facts, not assumptions. If someone had officially declared me dead, there had to be evidence. The problem was simple. The body in my grave wasn't mine. So how had they identified it? The answer came to me while sitting in my car: dental records. A badly damaged body could still be identified through dental records. If the police believed I was dead, they must have compared the body to mine. That evening, I drove to my old dentist's office. The building was closed, but I knew the layout well. A side window near the storage room had always had a faulty lock. 20 minutes later, I was inside. My heart pounded as I searched through the records room. Eventually, I found my file. At first, everything looked normal. Then I opened it and froze. The X-rays inside didn't belong to me. I checked again. Same name. Same file. Wrong teeth. Wrong jaw structure. Wrong person. For several seconds, I just stared at the images. Someone had replaced my records. Not after the accident. Before it. This wasn't a mistake made by the police. This wasn't a clerical error. Someone had prepared for my death in advance. I quickly photographed everything before putting the file back exactly where I found it. As I headed for the exit, another terrifying realization hit me. Whoever changed these records had access to private medical files. They had planned this carefully. Maybe for months. Maybe longer. And if they had gone through that much effort, then the crash that nearly killed me probably wasn't an accident at all. For the first time since waking up in that clinic, I stopped thinking like a victim. Someone had stolen my identity. Someone had buried a stranger under my name. Someone had convinced my wife, the police, and the entire city that I was dead. And I was beginning to realize just how far they were willing to go to keep it that way. I was beginning to realize that my death had been planned long before the night of the crash. The fake dental records proved that. Whoever was behind this had spent months preparing for the moment I disappeared. The question was simple. Why? The answer came when I remembered my life insurance policy. Years earlier, Sarah and I had purchased a modest policy in case something ever happened to one of us. It wasn't enough money to change anyone's life, but it would help cover expenses. If somebody had gone through all this trouble, there had to be a financial motive. Fortunately, I still had access to something nobody knew about, an old laptop hidden inside a storage unit I rented years ago. Late that night, I broke into the unit and powered it on. After several failed login attempts, I finally gained access to my financial accounts. What I found made my blood run cold. 6 months before the accident, my life insurance policy had been modified. The coverage amount had increased dramatically, turning a modest payout into several $1 million. I had no memory of approving such a change. Things got even worse when I reviewed the transaction history. The claim had already been processed and approved. Just 2 days after my funeral, the money had been transferred out. I followed the trail as far as I could. Half of the money had gone directly to Sarah. The other half had been sent to an offshore account, owned by a shell company I had never heard of before. I stared at the screen for several minutes, unable to look away. The crash, the fake dental records, the mysterious body in my grave, none of it was random. Someone had invested months into making sure I died on paper, and now I knew why. Millions of dollars were waiting on the other side of my death, but one detail bothered me more than anything else. Sarah wasn't the only person receiving money. There was someone else involved, someone hiding behind a fake company. Someone important enough to deserve half the payout. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't investigating a murder attempt anymore. I was uncovering a partnership. For 2 days, I focused entirely on the shell company that had received half of my life insurance money. It wasn't easy. Every record led to another fake address, another fake name, another dead end. But eventually, I found something useful. A business registration tied to a private country club on the outskirts of the city. The place was exclusive. Expensive cars lined the parking lot, and security cameras covered every entrance. I spent hours watching people come and go, waiting for something that connected to the company. Then, just as I was about to leave, a black luxury sedan pulled into the parking lot. Sarah stepped out. My heart immediately started racing. She looked around before entering the clubhouse. I waited a few minutes and followed from a distance. Through one of the large windows overlooking the golf course, I finally saw who she was meeting. The moment I recognized him, I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. Marcus, my business partner, my best friend, the man who had stood beside me at my wedding, the man I trusted with everything. For several seconds I couldn't move. My mind kept searching for another explanation. Maybe this was business. Maybe he was helping her after my death. Maybe I was jumping to conclusions. Then Marcus reached across the table and held her hand. Every excuse disappeared. I watched them talk and laugh together, not like grieving friends, not like business partners, like two people who had been close for a very long time. Eventually, they stood up and walked outside together. And then they kissed. The world seemed to go silent. 3 weeks ago, I thought I had the perfect life, a wife I loved, a business partner I trusted, a future I had spent years building. Now I was standing alone in a parking lot, watching the two people closest to me act like my death was the best thing that had ever happened to them. But the worst part wasn't the affair. It was what came next. As they walked toward Marcus's car, I overheard part of their conversation. "We're finally free," Sarah said. Marcus smiled. Everything went exactly as planned. At that moment, any doubt I had left disappeared. My wife wasn't a victim. My best friend wasn't innocent. And whatever happened on the night of that crash, they both knew far more than they were supposed to. For the next few days, I followed Marcus everywhere. I wanted proof, not suspicions, not assumptions, proof. Eventually, that decision paid off. One evening, after Marcus left his office, I slipped inside and searched the building. Most of the files were ordinary business records, but hidden behind a locked cabinet in his private office was a small ledger. The moment I opened it, I knew I had found something important. The pages contained dates, payments, and names. At first, none of it made sense. Then I found an entry matching the exact date of my accident. Beside it was a payment far larger than the others and a note that made my blood run cold. It wasn't my name written there. It was someone else's. I spent hours going through the records. Piece by piece, the truth began to emerge. The body buried in my grave belonged to a homeless drifter named Daniel Ross. He had no close family, no permanent address, and almost nobody who would report him missing. According to the ledger, Marcus had paid several men to bring Daniel to a specific location on the night of the crash. Somehow, Daniel ended up in the vehicle that was supposed to become my coffin. My hands were shaking by the time I finished reading. An innocent man was dead. A man whose only mistake was being vulnerable enough to become part of someone else's plan. Then I discovered one final entry. The hitmen had reported that the crash was successful. They believed I was dead, but a note written in Marcus's handwriting revealed the truth. Body never confirmed. Suddenly everything made sense. They never found me because they thought I had died in the wreckage. Instead, someone had pulled me from the crash and taken me to that underground clinic. Marcus and Sarah had buried the wrong man and collected the money before realizing their mistake. For weeks, my anger had been focused on what they did to me. But standing in that office, I realized this story wasn't only about my stolen life anymore. A completely innocent man had been murdered and buried under my name, while the people responsible celebrated their freedom. As I closed the ledger, I made myself a promise. I wasn't going to stop until Daniel Ross got his name back. And until the people who stole both our lives lost everything. The problem was that I couldn't go to the police yet. I had suspicions, a stolen identity, and a ledger that would raise questions, but I needed something stronger. More importantly, I wanted them to feel what I had felt. The fear, the uncertainty, the constant feeling that the ground beneath them was disappearing. So I decided to use the one advantage they never expected. As far as Marcus and Sarah knew, I was dead. A ghost. And ghosts can be terrifying. One night, while Sarah was out, I entered her apartment using a maintenance entrance I had discovered during my surveillance. I moved quietly through the dark rooms until I reached her bedroom. Then I placed something on her nightstand. My watch. The watch she had given me on our first wedding anniversary. I left without touching anything else. The next morning, I watched from a nearby building as Sarah discovered it. Even from that distance, I could see the color drain from her face. She picked up the watch, stared at it for several seconds, and immediately started calling someone. Marcus. That evening, Marcus arrived looking furious. The two of them argued for nearly an hour. Although I couldn't hear every word, I heard enough. This isn't funny. Do you think I did this? Then who did? For the first time since my accident, I saw genuine fear in their eyes. And I wasn't finished. A few days later, I hacked into Marcus's car audio system. The moment he started the engine, the song that had played during my funeral began blasting through the speakers. No matter what he pressed, the music wouldn't stop. I watched him pull over in panic. The fear was spreading. The perfect life they had built on my grave was starting to crack. Sarah became paranoid. Marcus became angry. They stopped trusting each other. Every unexpected phone call made them nervous. Every unknown face made them look twice. And as I watched their relationship slowly fall apart, I realized something important. Neither of them was afraid of getting caught. They were afraid that somehow I had come back. The pressure was finally working. Marcus was becoming reckless, and Sarah was falling apart. Every time they met, the arguments became louder. The trust between them was disappearing. I knew it was only a matter of time before one of them cracked. My money was on Sarah. Unlike Marcus, she wasn't a criminal. She was selfish, greedy, and willing to betray me, but she wasn't built for this kind of pressure. The fear was eating her alive, so I decided to push a little harder. One evening, I followed her to an underground parking garage beneath her apartment building. She had just finished shopping and was walking toward her car when the lights suddenly dimmed. The garage was nearly empty. Perfect. As she unlocked her car, I stepped out from behind a concrete pillar. Sarah looked up and froze. The bag slipped from her hands and crashed onto the floor. For several seconds, she simply stared at me. Her face turned completely white. "No," she whispered. Tears immediately filled her eyes. "No, that's impossible." She stumbled backward until she hit the side of her car. I could see genuine terror in her face. Not guilt. Not regret. Pure terror. She thought she was looking at a dead man. "Hello, Sarah." The moment I spoke, she let out a small scream. "You died," she said. "I saw the body. I buried you." "Did you?" The question hit her harder than I expected. She started shaking. I stepped closer. "Tell me the truth." At first she refused, then I mentioned Marcus. Everything changed. The fear in her eyes turned into anger. Years of lies and manipulation suddenly started pouring out. She admitted Marcus had convinced her that the insurance money would solve all their problems. He promised they could start over together. He promised nobody would ever get hurt. But the plan didn't stop when I disappeared. Marcus controlled the money. Marcus controlled the evidence. Marcus controlled everything. And now Sarah realized she was just another person he could sacrifice if things went wrong. The more she talked, the more emotional she became. She blamed Marcus for everything. She blamed herself. She blamed greed. What she didn't know was that every word was being recorded. Hidden inside my jacket was a small recording device capturing her confession. When she finally finished speaking, she looked completely broken. For the first time since my accident, I had something better than suspicion. I had proof. And if Sarah was willing to betray Marcus this easily, then their entire empire of lies was about to collapse. After listening to the recording several times, I realized Sarah had accidentally given me something even more valuable than her confession. During her panic, she mentioned a private bank vault. According to her, Marcus kept physical copies of everything there: insurance documents, transaction records, fake identities, and details about Daniel Ross. It was his safety net, the one place where he stored proof of everything they had done. The problem was obvious. I couldn't simply walk into a bank and access it. Officially, I didn't exist. To the world, I was a dead man. Fortunately, Sarah was still very much alive, and she was terrified. A few days later, I arranged another meeting with her. The moment she saw me, the fear returned to her face. She looked exhausted. The guilt, paranoia, and constant arguments with Marcus were finally taking their toll. This time, I didn't threaten her. I simply told her the truth. Marcus was already preparing for the possibility that she might turn against him. If he got caught, he would blame everything on her. Deep down, she already knew that. I gave her a choice. Help me get the contents of the vault, or wait until Marcus sacrificed her to save himself. The next morning, she entered the bank. I watched from across the street as she disappeared inside. Every minute felt like an hour. My heart pounded as I imagined every possible outcome. Maybe she would betray me. Maybe she would warn Marcus. Maybe she would simply walk away. Then she finally emerged carrying a large envelope. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was winning. But the feeling didn't last. The moment Sarah reached her car, another vehicle suddenly pulled in front of her. The driver's door flew open. Marcus stepped out. Even from a distance, I could see the rage on his face. He knew. Somehow, he knew exactly what she had done. And as I watched him march toward her car, I realized the situation was about to become far more dangerous than either of us had expected. Sarah tried to lock the doors, but Marcus was already there. He yanked the driver's door open and grabbed the envelope from her hands. Even from across the street, I could hear them shouting. People in the parking lot started turning their heads. Marcus didn't care. Months of planning were falling apart, and panic was finally replacing his confidence. I followed them as they left the bank. Marcus forced Sarah into his car and drove away. Every instinct told me to call the police, but I knew they wouldn't act quickly enough. Not without evidence. Not without understanding the full story. So I stayed on them. Nearly an hour later, they arrived at an abandoned shipping yard near the docks. The place was deserted except for rows of rusting containers and empty warehouses. I parked at a distance and moved closer on foot. From behind a stack of containers, I finally saw them. Sarah was standing near one of the warehouses, terrified. Marcus had the envelope in one hand and a pistol in the other. The sight made my blood run cold. Everything had changed. This was no longer about money. This was about survival. Marcus was screaming at her, demanding to know who she had been working with. Sarah kept insisting she didn't know what he was talking about, but neither of us believed that lie anymore. Then Marcus said something that made me step out of the shadows. "You should have stayed loyal." His back was facing me. I took a slow breath and spoke. "That's funny coming from you." The moment Marcus heard my voice, his entire body froze. Slowly, he turned around. For a second, he simply stared. His face went completely pale. It was the first time he had seen me since the night of the crash. The first time he had looked into the eyes of the man he thought was buried. "Ethan," he whispered. The gun lowered slightly. The confidence was gone. The arrogance was gone. For the first time, Marcus looked afraid. Then just as quickly, the fear turned into a smile. A cold, dangerous smile. "I knew it," he said quietly. "I knew you survived." And at that moment, I realized Marcus wasn't shocked to see me. He had been expecting me. For a few seconds, the three of us stood frozen in the middle of the shipping yard. The cold wind moved through the empty containers while Marcus kept the gun pointed in my direction. Sarah looked terrified, but Marcus looked almost relieved. "You know," he said with a laugh, "I spent weeks wondering where you were." I stayed silent. "The hitmen swore you were dead. Then strange things started happening. The watch, the messages, the music. Eventually I figured it out." His finger tightened around the trigger. "You should have stayed hidden." I could feel my heart pounding, but I forced myself to remain calm. This was exactly where I needed him. Talking, confessing, believing he was still in control. Marcus slowly began pacing. Years of arrogance poured out of him. He talked about the insurance money, the affair, the fake records, and how easy it had been to erase my life. According to him, people only see what they're told to see. A death certificate, a funeral, a grieving widow. Nobody asks questions. Then he looked directly at me. "You were already dead before the crash, Ethan. You just didn't know it yet." Sarah began crying. Marcus ignored her. He raised the gun higher. "I buried one man already. Burying another won't be difficult." For the first time all night, I smiled. Marcus frowned. That smile confused him. Because if I were really trapped, I wouldn't be smiling. You still don't get it, do you? I asked. His expression changed. What are you talking about? I glanced toward one of the warehouses. Then another. Then the security tower overlooking the yard. Slowly, Marcus began following my gaze. The confidence disappeared from his face. You talk too much, Marcus. A second later, red and blue lights exploded across the shipping yard. Sirens filled the night. Police vehicles rushed through every entrance at once. Marcus spun around in disbelief. Officers poured from their cars with weapons drawn. Drop the gun. Get on the ground. Everything happened at once. Marcus looked at me. Then at the police. Then back at me. Finally, he understood. The confession. Sarah's recording. The bank documents. The GPS coordinates. I had given everything to the police hours earlier. This wasn't his trap. It was mine. As officers surrounded him from every direction, Marcus slowly lowered the weapon. For the first time since the night of my accident, I saw something in his eyes that I had never seen before. Defeat. And as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, I realized my nightmare was finally coming to an end. The next few days were a blur of interviews, paperwork, and questions. The police took me into protective custody while they verified my identity and untangled the mess surrounding my supposed death. Officially, I was still a dead man, which made every conversation complicated. Some officers looked at me with suspicion. Others looked at me like they had seen a ghost. What kept me going was knowing that Marcus and Sarah were finally being questioned. Through a two-way mirror at the police station, I watched the interrogations unfold. Marcus sat silently for hours, refusing to answer almost every question. The confidence he once carried was gone, but he still believed he could outsmart everyone. Sarah was different. The moment investigators presented the bank records and played portions of her recorded confession, she broke down. For the first time, she stopped pretending to be a victim. She admitted the affair. She admitted helping Marcus collect the insurance money. She admitted knowing that my death would make them rich. Every word pushed her deeper into the hole she had helped create. The detectives didn't need much else. The offshore accounts, the fake records, and the financial transfers were already painting a clear picture. Marcus tried to remain silent, but silence couldn't save him anymore. The ledger from his office connected him directly to Daniel Ross. The financial transactions connected him to the insurance fraud, and Sarah's testimony connected him to the entire conspiracy. Piece by piece, the case was becoming impossible to deny. As I sat behind the glass watching them, I expected to feel victorious. Instead, I felt tired. These were two people I had once trusted with my life. One had been my wife. The other had been my best friend. Now they sat in separate interrogation rooms, each trying to save themselves from the consequences of their own choices. By the end of the week, formal charges were filed against both of them. Sarah lowered her head when she was escorted away. Marcus never looked at anyone. For the first time since waking up in that underground clinic, I wasn't wondering whether justice would happen. I was wondering whether I would ever be able to trust anyone again. The answer depended on what was buried beneath my gravestone. A week after Marcus and Sarah were charged, the court approved an exhumation order. It was the final piece needed to prove my story. Until the body in my grave was identified, I would remain trapped in a strange limbo, alive but legally dead. The morning of the exhumation was cold and overcast. I stood at the edge of the cemetery surrounded by police officers, forensic specialists, and attorneys. Just a few weeks earlier, I had stood in the same place staring at my own headstone in disbelief. Now I was watching workers prepare to open the grave. As the casket was lifted from the ground, a strange feeling settled over me. It was like watching my old life being dug up alongside it. The man I had been before the accident was gone forever. The trusting husband, the loyal friend, the man who believed his future was secure. None of those people existed anymore. The forensic team worked carefully. DNA samples were collected and compared against records recovered during the investigation. The results arrived 2 days later. The body was not mine. It belonged to Daniel Ross. For a long moment, I simply stared at the report. Even though I already knew the truth, seeing his name written there made everything feel real. Daniel wasn't just evidence in a criminal case. He was a human being whose life had been stolen so Marcus and Sarah could steal mine. Thanks to the information in Marcus's ledger, investigators managed to track down distant relatives of Daniel. They hadn't heard from him in years and had no idea what had happened to him. For the first time since his death, somebody knew where he was. The state officially voided my death certificate a few days later. My identity was restored. My accounts were unfrozen. Legally, I was alive again. But the moment that stayed with me wasn't receiving those documents. It was watching workers remove my name from a gravestone that had never belonged to me. Because for the first time since this nightmare began, the truth was finally being buried, and the lies were finally being dug up. A few days after my identity was officially restored, I received an unexpected envelope from the county jail. The sender's name made me freeze. Sarah. For several minutes, I simply stared at the envelope resting on my kitchen table. Part of me wanted to throw it away without opening it. Another part wanted answers. Eventually, curiosity won. Inside was a handwritten letter. The first thing she wrote wasn't an excuse. It wasn't a justification. It wasn't a request for forgiveness. It was a single sentence. I never stopped regretting it. As I continued reading, Sarah admitted things she had never told the police. Marcus hadn't approached her after the accident. He had been manipulating her long before it. Over time, he convinced her that our marriage was failing, that I cared more about work than about her, and that a different life was waiting for her if she was brave enough to take it. None of that excused what she did. But for the first time, I understood how she had fallen so far. The woman I married hadn't disappeared overnight. She had simply made one selfish decision after another until she became someone neither of us would recognize. Near the end of the letter, she described the moment she saw me in the parking garage. She wrote that for a few seconds she genuinely believed she was looking at a ghost, not because I was dead, but because she suddenly remembered the man she had betrayed. Then came the final paragraph. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I only hope that one day, when you think about me, you remember the woman I was before greed turned me into someone else. I finished reading and quietly folded the letter. To my surprise, I wasn't angry. The anger had burned itself out weeks ago. What remained was sadness. Sadness for the marriage we destroyed. Sadness for the future that never happened. Sadness for the choices that can never be undone. I walked to the window and looked out across the city. Somewhere beyond those buildings, Sarah was waiting to be sentenced. Marcus was doing the same. Their story was nearing its end. Mine was finally beginning again. For the first time in years, I didn't feel hatred when I thought about Sarah. I felt something far more powerful. I felt ready to let her go. But there was still one thing I needed to do before I could truly move forward. I needed to visit Daniel Ross. Not the man himself. His grave. A month earlier, Daniel had been buried beneath my name. He had died alone, forgotten by almost everyone. If Marcus had succeeded, nobody would have ever known what happened to him. He would have remained a missing person while I remained a dead man. Now, thanks to the investigation, Daniel finally had a proper headstone bearing his real name. The day I visited the cemetery, the sky was clear and quiet. There were no reporters, no police officers, and no lawyers, just me and a man I had never met. I stood there for several minutes staring at the stone. Daniel Ross. Born 1982. Died 2025. A simple inscription beneath his name read, "Finally remembered." His distant relatives had chosen those words. I thought they were perfect. For a long time, I wondered why I had survived that night, why someone had pulled me from the wreckage and taken me to that underground clinic instead of leaving me to die. If things had happened slightly differently, Daniel's story would never have been discovered. Neither would mine. I placed a small bouquet of flowers beside the grave and quietly thanked him. It probably sounds strange. After all, Daniel had never done anything for me. But because the truth about his death was uncovered, the truth about my life was uncovered too. As I turned to leave, I noticed another visitor approaching from the distance, an elderly woman carrying flowers. One of Daniel's relatives. She stopped beside me and smiled softly. "Are you Ethan?" she asked. When I nodded, tears filled her eyes. She thanked me for refusing to give up, for refusing to let Daniel remain nameless, for giving their family answers after weeks of uncertainty. I didn't know what to say, so I simply told her the truth. No one deserves to disappear without being remembered. As I walked away from the cemetery, I felt something I hadn't felt since before the accident. Peace. Not because Marcus had been arrested. Not because Sarah had confessed. Not because I had gotten my life back. But because one innocent man had finally gotten his name back too. And somehow that mattered just as much. For months, my life had revolved around a single goal: uncover the truth. Every morning I woke up thinking about Marcus. Every night I went to sleep thinking about Sarah. Their betrayal had become the center of my world. But as I drove home from the cemetery, I realized something strange. The story was over. There were no more clues to follow, no more secrets to uncover, no more lies waiting to be exposed. For the first time since the accident, I was free. A few weeks later, the trial finally began. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records, witness testimony, the ledger, Sarah's confession, and Marcus's own recorded statements left little room for doubt. The jury reached a verdict faster than anyone expected. Both were found guilty. When the sentence was read, I felt no joy, no satisfaction, only closure. The chapter of my life that they had stolen was finally finished. After the trial, reporters constantly asked me the same question. What happens next? At first, I didn't know how to answer. For so long, my identity had been tied to what happened to me. The man who survived. The man who attended his own funeral. The man who exposed the conspiracy. But I didn't want to be known for any of those things. I wanted to be known for what came after. Slowly, I returned to work. I rebuilt relationships that had been neglected for years. I started exercising again. I traveled. I laughed more than I had in a very long time. Little by little, life stopped feeling like survival and started feeling like living. One evening, nearly a year after the accident, I found myself standing on a quiet beach watching the sunset. The waves rolled gently onto the shore as the sky turned shades of orange and gold. A year earlier, I had been buried, at least according to the world. Now I was standing here with a second chance most people never get. I thought about Marcus. I thought about Sarah. I thought about Daniel. Then I let those thoughts drift away with the tide. Because some stories aren't meant to be carried forever. Some stories are meant to be survived. And as the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, I smiled for the first time in a long while. Not because I had won, but because I was finally ready to move on.